The morning of my wedding, my father looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I will not walk you down that aisle if you go through with this." 200 guests were already seated in the chapel. My dress cost more than my first car. The florist had spent 3 hours arranging white peonies on every pew. And my father was standing in the hallway outside the bridal suite with his arms crossed, his jaw set, his mind completely made up. His problem wasn't that he didn't like Liam. His problem was what Liam did for a living. Liam Booker is a licensed electrician. He owns his own company, Booker Electric, 6 employees, fully insured, serving 3 counties in central Ohio. He bought his house at 28, he has 0 debt. He coaches youth baseball on Saturday mornings because he genuinely loves it, not because it looks good on paper. He is, without question, the most dependable and kind person I have ever met in my life. But he didn't go to college, and to my father, that was the only thing that mattered. I need to back up because the story of my wedding morning is really a story that started about 20 years before I ever met Liam. I just didn't know that yet. My name is Faye. I grew up in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, the younger of 2 daughters. My sister, Renee, is 4 years older than me and has always been sharper than me, quicker to read a room, quicker to figure out what's actually going on underneath the surface of things. I have always been the one who believed what people told me. Our father, his name is Howard, built his entire identity around one idea: respectability. His parents were working-class people. His father was a sheet metal worker. His mother cleaned houses, and Howard spent his whole life running from that. He got a business degree, married a woman from a good family, moved to the suburbs, and spent the next 30 years making absolutely sure everyone around him knew he had arrived somewhere. What that meant for us growing up was a very specific kind of pressure. Grades, presentation, the right activities, the right friends, the right college. Howard never hit us, never screamed at us. He was too controlled for that. What he did instead was make you feel, very quietly and very clearly, that his love was conditional on your performance. I got into Ohio State. Renee got into Northwestern. Howard was satisfied. I met Liam in my mid-20s, about a year after I graduated. I was working at a property management company, which is a boring way of saying I coordinated maintenance requests for apartment buildings across Columbus. Liam's company was one of our vendors. He showed up one afternoon to fix a tripped breaker in a unit on Morse Road, and I happened to be there doing a walkthrough. He was wearing a gray t-shirt, and he had a scratch on his arm from where he'd caught it on a wire casing, and he didn't seem to notice or care. He shook my hand and asked me if I knew anything about the building's electrical panel history, and when I said I didn't, he said, "No worries, I'll figure it out," and went to work like it was the simplest thing in the world. I thought about him for 3 days before I finally texted the office number on his business card and said I had a question about the invoice. I did not have a question about the invoice. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. Liam is steady in a way that used to confuse me because I'd grown up around men who performed confidence. He doesn't perform anything, he just is who he is, completely and without apology. I told my father about Liam probably 4 months into us dating. My mother loved him almost immediately. She said he reminded her of her own father, which she meant as a compliment. My father asked what he did, and when I told him, he got very quiet in that particular way of his and said, "Is he planning to go back to school?" I said I didn't think so. I said Liam owned his own company and seemed to be doing well. My father nodded slowly, the way he does when he's filing information away to use later. Over the next 2 years he used it constantly. Not loudly, just consistently. "How's Liam's little business going?" The word little always, as if he trained himself to insert it automatically. Comments at dinner about how trade work was fine for some people. A story he told more than once about a guy he went to high school with who worked in construction his whole life and couldn't afford to retire. He was never talking about Liam directly, he was just talking. Liam knew what was happening. He never said anything about it to me, not once, because that's who Liam is. But I could see it on his face sometimes at family dinners. This careful, quiet decision he kept making to not take the bait. When Liam proposed, he did it on a Tuesday night in our kitchen. No reservation, no photographer hiding in the bushes. He made pasta, We ate it and then he said, "I've been thinking about this for a while. I want to marry you, Faye. You don't have to decide right now." He had a ring. I said yes before he finished the sentence. My father's response, when I told him, was to ask whether Liam had spoken to him first. Liam had not, because Liam is 31 years old and so am I, and neither of us had considered that a requirement. My father said, "I see," and changed the subject. For the next 8 months, he was civil but cold. He came to the engagement party, he sat through dress shopping, he wrote a check for half of the venue deposit, which he reminded me of at least 4 times. He was doing everything a father is supposed to do, technically, while making sure I knew it was costing him something. 3 weeks before the wedding, he called me and said he wanted to talk. I drove to my parents' house and sat at the kitchen table, and he told me that he was worried about my future, that he had done some thinking, that Liam was a decent guy, but that he wasn't sure an electrician could provide the kind of stability I deserved long term. He said he wasn't trying to control me, he was just being honest. I told him that Liam made more money than I did, and had more savings than I did, and owned property, and that if stability was his concern was based on nothing real. My father said that finances weren't the only kind of stability that mattered. I asked him what he actually meant. He couldn't quite say it out loud, so he talked around it for 10 more minutes. I drove home shaking. When I told Liam, he just sat with me for a while without saying anything. Then he said, "Do you want to get married?" I said yes. He said, "Then we're getting married. Your dad will come around or he won't." He was wrong about that last part. My dad did not come around. The morning of the wedding, I was in the bridal suite at the chapel with Renee and my 2 best friends, Constance and Blythe, getting ready. It was October, which was when I'd always imagined getting married for some reason, and the light coming through the windows was that particular kind of pale gold that only happens in fall. I was happy. I was genuinely uncomplicated happy for about 45 minutes. Then my father knocked on the door. He came in, looked at me in my dress, and I could see him working through something behind his eyes. I thought for 1 second that he was going to say something real, something a father is supposed to say to his daughter on her wedding day. Instead, he said, "I need you to understand something. If you walk out there and marry this man, I am not walking you down that aisle. I won't do it. I think you're making a mistake and I won't be part of it." Renee said, "Dad." He held up his hand. He was looking at me. "I'm giving you the chance to call this off right now. We can make an announcement. Guests will understand. This doesn't have to be—" "Get out," Renee said. Her voice was completely flat. She walked to the door and opened it. "Get out of this room right now." My father looked at her like she'd slapped him. Then he straightened his jacket and left. The door closed. I sat down on the small sofa in the corner because my legs weren't working correctly. Constance put her hand on my back. Blythe went to get water. Renee crouched down in front of me and said, "Listen to me. You're going to walk down that aisle. Do you hear me? I don't care if I have to do it myself." I nodded. I believed her. But I also felt something collapse somewhere inside me. Quiet and final, like a wall coming down in a room I hadn't visited in a long time. The ceremony was supposed to start in 22 minutes. One of the chapel coordinators knocked on the door to give us the 10-minute warning. I had fixed my face back into something that looked like a bride. Renee was adjusting my veil. Constance was telling a story about her own wedding to make me laugh, and it was almost working. Then there was another knock. It was the chapel coordinator again, and her expression was different this time. She said, "Miss Faye? There's a gentleman here. He says he's your great-uncle. He says he's been waiting a long time to meet you, and he'd like to know if—" She paused. "He said to tell you he knows your name." I stared at her. "He's in a wheelchair," she said. "He's been waiting outside. He wouldn't come in without your permission." I looked at Renee. Renee's face had gone completely still in a way I had never seen before. "What's his name?" she said. The coordinator checked the small notepad in her hand. "He said his name is Gene. Gene Calloway." Renee sat down on the sofa so suddenly it was like her knees just stopped working. She put her hand over her mouth. "Renee," I said. "What is it? "Who is Jean Calloway?" She looked at me with an expression I still don't have a word for. Then she said, "Faye, that's Dad's uncle, Grandma's brother." She stopped. "We were told he died. We were told he died before you were born." I went to the door myself. He was in the hallway in a wheelchair. A man in his late 70s with white hair and our family's same dark eyes. He was wearing a blue suit that looked like it had been pressed very carefully by someone who cared about getting it right. He was holding a small card in his lap that had my name on it in handwritten letters. When he saw me, his face changed in a way that made me understand, immediately, that this moment had been living inside him for a very long time. "Faye," he said. His voice was rough and quiet. "I've seen pictures. But you look like your grandmother did when she was your age." Same exact smile. I said, "We were told you were dead." He said, "I know." I brought him inside. "His name is Jean Calloway. He is my grandmother's younger brother, which makes him my great-uncle. He is 78 years old. He has lived for the past 19 years in the nursing facility in Dayton, Ohio, which is about 75 miles from where I grew up, in a suburb of Columbus. He did not die before I was born. He was not missing. He was not estranged by his own choice. He had been placed in that facility by my father. The story Jean told me, there in the bridal suite with my wedding 10 minutes away, went like this. He and my grandmother had been close their whole lives. When she died, I was 6. I remember it vaguely. I remember my mother crying. Jean was her executor. He had access to the family property. Specifically, he had access to a piece of land in rural Ohio that my grandmother had inherited from her own parents. 40 acres outside of Circleville that, at the time of her death, had been assessed at somewhere around $400,000. My father was her only child. He stood to inherit everything. But Jean, as executor, had discretion over how the estate was handled and the timing of the transfer. My father and Jean had a dispute. I don't know everything about what was said. Jean was careful, even 19 years later, about not speaking about it as a grievance. He kept saying we disagreed, and I think he believed he was protecting his interests. What I understood was that my father had wanted to sell the land immediately, and Jean had wanted to honor a provision my grandmother had left that said the land shouldn't be sold for at least 5 years to give the family time to decide together what to do with it. My father did not want to wait 5 years. What happened next, Jean told me carefully and without drama. My father had him declared mentally incapacitated. He hired a lawyer. He had Jean evaluated. Jean said he had been going through a period of grief after my grandmother's death that he now recognizes had the appearance of depression, and that he had not been thinking or communicating clearly during that time. The evaluation found him unfit to serve as executor. My father was appointed in his place. The land was sold within the year. The proceeds, somewhere in the range of $380,000, went to my father. Jean was moved to a care facility under a legal guardianship that gave my father control over his living situation, his finances, and his communications. My father had him placed at a facility 2 counties over. He told the whole family, that Jean had died. A small private service. No body, no burial. Just an announcement. Jean had been trying to reach her family for 19 years. He'd had limited access to phones. He'd written letters that were apparently intercepted. About 3 years ago, a younger nurse named Portia started working at the facility and thought something about his situation seemed wrong. She helped him connect with the legal aid organization. He had been working through that process slowly. His health is not good, his mobility is severely limited, but he had found us. He had found me. He had heard, through some chain of connection I still don't fully understand, that there was a wedding. And he asked if he could come. I stood there in my wedding dress looking at this man I had been told was dead. This man my father had buried alive for 19 years to take a piece of land. And I thought about my father standing in that same room 20 minutes ago telling me that Liam couldn't provide stability. I thought about the word respectability and what my father had made it mean. I thought about my grandmother, who I barely remembered, and whether she would have recognized the son she raised. I asked Jean if he would walk me down the aisle. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "I've been waiting a long time to do something like that for this family. We were 11 minutes late to start. Nobody in that chapel knew why." Liam was standing at the altar, and when the doors opened and he saw me come through with a man in a wheelchair, a man he had never seen before, a man I had never met before that morning, I watched his face move through confusion and then something else. Something careful and open. And he just waited. Gene Calloway walked me down the aisle of that chapel. His wheelchair moved slowly and I held his arm the whole way, and I didn't cry until we were about halfway down, and then I couldn't stop. Liam shook Gene's hand before Gene moved to the side. I don't know what Liam said to him. Whatever it was, Gene laughed. My father was not in the chapel. He had left the building. The ceremony was 23 minutes long. The pastor had known us for 2 years, and he kept it simple and real and right. When Liam said "I do," he said it like he'd been planning to say it his whole life. We had the reception at a venue about a mile from the chapel. I didn't tell most people what had happened that morning. It wasn't the time, and I didn't have the words yet. I introduced Gene to people as my great-uncle and let them make of that what they would. He sat at a table near the dance floor, and my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, stayed near him most of the night. My mother knew something had happened. She kept looking at me with a question in her eyes, but she waited. Renee did not wait. Renee found me near the end of the night and pulled me into the coat room and said, "I've been thinking about this for 4 hours. We need to talk to a lawyer." She was right, we did. Here's what we found out in the months after the wedding, working with an elder law attorney named Warren out of Columbus, who was recommended to us by the legal aid organization that had helped Gene. The original declaration of incapacity had procedural problems. The evaluation my father had used had been conducted by a single physician in Ohio. For a guardianship proceeding of this nature, the standard practice involves independent evaluation, and there were questions about the connection between that physician and my father's legal team at the time. The guardianship had been extended and renewed over the years without proper review hearings. Gene had filed complaints that had not been properly processed. There was also the matter of the land sale. The 40 acres outside of Circleville had sold for $382,000. Under the terms of my grandmother's estate, with Gene properly serving as executor, the distribution should have included Gene himself. My grandmother had left him a specific bequest of $50,000, plus a share of any real property proceeds above a certain threshold. He had received none of it. We filed a civil suit. My father's attorney contacted us within 3 weeks. I will not go through all of it. It took 14 months. There were depositions and counterfilings, and a mediation session that lasted 9 hours and left everyone in the building looking like they'd aged 5 years. My father, to his credit or his shame depending on how you look at it, did not fight the guardianship termination. Gene was formally released from the legal guardianship in month 4. My father paid the legal fees for that. The financial claim to Quanger, the final settlement reached in month 14, required my father to pay Gene $260,000. This was not everything Gene was owed. Warren told us that if we'd gone to trial, we might have gotten more, but Gene was 78 and tired, and he said he'd rather have the money and his name than spend another year of his life in a courtroom. I think about what my father spent all of that on. His house is nice. His car is nice. He takes vacations. He has a reputation in this suburb as a successful, respectable man. He has been paying for that reputation for 20 years with money that belonged to a man he buried alive and then told his children was dead. My father and I do not have a relationship right now. I don't know what we will have in the future. My mother stayed with him through the legal process, which is her choice, and I have tried not to make her feel like she has to choose. She calls me every Sunday. She has been to our house for dinner several times. She adores Liam, which she is no longer shy about saying. Renee stopped speaking to my father entirely 6 months after the wedding. She told him in a letter that she would be open to communication if he took accountability and that she would not be open to it otherwise. She has not heard back. Gene moved out of the nursing facility about 8 months after the guardianship was terminated. He is living now in an assisted living community in Columbus, a real one that he chose, near enough for us to visit. I go on Sunday afternoons when I can. We are still learning each other. which is a strange and slow and genuinely good thing. He told me once when we were sitting in the small garden outside his building that the hardest part of those 19 years was not the facility itself. He said the facility was fine, that there were people there he liked. The hardest part, he said, was knowing that there were people in the world who shared his blood and who had been told he didn't exist. I thought about you kids, he said. I wondered what you were like. I wondered if your grandmother would recognize you. He paused. She would have. She absolutely would have. I go back sometimes to that moment in the hallway before my wedding. This man in a blue suit holding a card with my name on it, waiting for permission to come in. 19 years of letters that didn't arrive. 19 years of a family that had been told to move on. And he didn't come in without asking. He waited until I said yes. Liam's company is doing well, if anyone's wondering. He hired a 7th employee last spring. He's been talking about expanding into the next county. He still coaches baseball on Saturdays. He still makes pasta on Tuesday nights. He still makes every decision like it's the simplest thing in the world. My father called me respectable once, before everything happened. He meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. I have been thinking about what that word actually means for about a year now, and I think I'm finally getting somewhere with it. Respectable is not the same as good. Respectable is about what other people see. Good is about what you do when you think no one is watching, or when the person watching can't do anything about it. My father was very concerned with the first one. He spent his life building a version of himself that would satisfy a particular audience. He just forgot somewhere along the way that his children were watching too, that Jean was watching. That eventually the distance between what you perform and what you actually are becomes a distance that can't be closed anymore. I don't want my father's version of a life. I want something that can survive being looked at directly. Liam and I are doing that. Jean is part of our family now, which is strange and new and completely right. Renee is figuring out what her life looks like without the pressure of a father's approval, which I think is actually setting her free in ways she's only starting to see. And somewhere outside Circleville, there are 40 acres of farmland that used to belong to my grandmother that were sold to fund a reputation that never really bought what they were supposed to buy. I drove past that land once, about 3 months after the settlement. It's a soybean field now. I parked on the road and looked at it for a while. My grandmother grew up in Ohio. She knew what a field looked like. I'd like to think she knew. Somewhere, that the truth has a way of finding its level, that it doesn't disappear just because someone tells it to, that it waits, the way Jean waited, patient, in a blue suit holding a card with your name on it, until you're ready to let it in. I thought a lot about what my father actually believed he was building. Not the house, not the reputation, not the money from that land outside Circleville, but the internal story he told himself every day about who he was. I think he genuinely believed he had earned something, that the distance he'd traveled from his parents' working-class life was a moral achievement, not just a financial one. That the trappings of respectability were proof of something real about his character. That's the part that stays with me, not the anger. The anger has mostly settled into something quieter, but the sadness of a person who confused the performance of goodness with goodness itself. My father could write a check, sit through a dinner, show up in the right suit. He was fluent in the language of a responsible, successful man. What he couldn't do, it turned out, was make a hard choice that cost him something and still be okay. When Jean stood between him and what he wanted, he didn't rise to it, he just removed Jean. Every consequence that followed was a direct result of that one decision and the 20 years of smaller decisions he made to maintain it. That's not fate, it's not luck running out. It's just the math of who you actually are catching up to the image you've been projecting. You can manage the distance between those two things for a long time. But the distance doesn't close on its own, it grows. What I keep coming back to, the thing I want to actually hold onto from all of this, is Jean sitting in that hallway in his pressed blue suit waiting for my permission to come in. He had every reason to be bitter. 19 years, grievances that a court eventually said were real and compensable. And he still would not walk through that door without being asked. He had maintained, through all of it, a basic dignity that my father, with all his polish and his credentials and his carefully curated life, never actually possessed. Liam has it too. That's what I was trying to say to my father. In every conversation we had, in every version of he's doing well and he owns his own company, I wasn't defending Liam's income. I was trying to point at something my father had trained himself not to see, that the measure of a person isn't what they can perform in public. It's what they do with the private moments, the inconvenient ones, the ones where nobody's watching and there's no audience to impress. Liam fixed a breaker on Morse Road and didn't make it into anything more than what it was. Gene sat in a nursing facility for 19 years and kept his name and his sense of himself intact. Renee walked across the room and opened a door and said, "Get out," when it needed to be said. These are not dramatic gestures. They are just people knowing who they are and acting accordingly, over and over in the small moments that add up to a life. I'm still figuring out who I am in that same way. I believed what I was told for a long time because believing was easier than looking. That's something I have to own. But I also know that I let Liam in when I didn't have to, and I walked down that aisle next to a man I'd never met, and I decided that the truth, even when it was sitting in a wheelchair in a hallway and was 19 years overdue, deserved to come inside. That decision cost me my father, at least for now. I don't know what we'll be to each other eventually. But I know what I have. And I know it's real, because it holds up when you look directly at it.